If you're the kind of partisan voter who puts on the team jersey and follows the playbook, no matter what the score or where it leads, then you probably know how you feel about Kavanaugh's situation. The standoff over Kavanaugh and a troubling allegation stemming from a teen party 36 years ago raises a series of questions I've thought and written about a lot over the years, which get to the heart of how we assess character, especially in someone who, if handed the job, will have it for life. Let's walk through a few of them. All we can really do here is assess the credibility of Ford's account. It probably means something that she has repeated it many times in private venues over the years. She names Mark Judge, still a close friend of Kavanaugh's, as the eyewitness, which would be a pretty dumb thing to do if you were making up a malicious story you wanted people to believe. I suppose it's possible, if unlikely, that Ford confused Kavanaugh with some other prep school kid she barely knew. To me, Ford's account seemed more credible and more independent before she declined to testify and called for an FBI investigation, which put her squarely in league with Democrats trying to delay Kavanaugh's nomination. That felt political, and maybe her lawyer isn't serving her well. But leaving those machinations aside, it certainly seems like Ford believes every word of her own story and that at least some substantial part of it has to be true. A second, more complicated question, is whether the story, if it is in fact true, ought to be disqualifying. The easiest answer to give here is that Kavanaugh's behavior, if that's the case, was disgusting and probably criminal. It was, and that he showed no remorse, he didn't, and that he thought so little of this girl that he doesn't even recall the specific incident, which I guess is possible. In this moment of national catharsis, the best way for a guy like me to prove himself above suspicion, or try to, anyway, is to agree that the accused is morally irredeemable and send him into permanent exile. Except that, as I've written before, none of us ought to be defined by the ugliest moments of our lives, and especially not our teenage lives. As I was once told by Bob Kerrey, the former senator who went through his own painful public reckoning over his actions as a Navy SEAL in Vietnam, we are not the worst things we've ever done. Character demands context. The moral arc of a lifetime matters. Not everything is equally relevant. Mistakes of youth can be humiliating and painful, but they can also help you grow into a more serious, more compassionate adult. To my mind, Kavanaugh deserves the opportunity, at least, to be judged through that wider lens. This, however, leads me to what I think is now the central question surrounding Kavanaugh's imperiled nomination. Because whatever else is or isn't true, whatever has been clouded in memory by 36 intervening years, a few things about Kavanaugh back then seem undeniable. He traveled in the same social circle as Ford, or at least for a while. He was immature and callow. He probably wasn't great to the girls he knew. He drank more than a kid should. Judge, the buddy whom Ford places in the room that night, later wrote a fictionalized addiction memoir, in which a character named Bart O'Kavanaugh drinks himself into a vomiting fit. Like I said, high school isn't the totality of a life. But here's the point. There are plenty of ways someone as eloquent as Kavanaugh could have responded publicly to the allegation against him. He could have said, like a lot of misguided teenagers, I drank irresponsibly, and I have only vague memories of that time. I am certain as I stand here today that I never attacked anyone, and I have no specific recollection of Dr. Ford. But if I or any of my friends were involved in immature behavior that was painful to anyone at the time, I regret it. But that's not what Kavanaugh is saying. He dismisses not only the allegation but the context around it. He says he wasn't that kind of kid. He says he wasn't there, in the house Ford can describe in detail. He makes a victim of her all over again, by essentially calling her delusional. He makes no allowance for the possibility that his own memory is blurred by inebriated youth. And maybe there is a pattern here. This is essentially what Kavanaugh did when he was asked, during his last confirmation hearing for the federal bench, whether he had been involved in internal discussions over the detention of enemy combatants during the George W. Bush administration. He denied it completely, when in fact the more complicated truth, that he had been tangential to those discussions but sometimes involved, would have sufficed. Just as he flatly rejected the assertion that he'd ever lived beyond his means and racked up credit card debt to pay for it, even though the truth was probably more shaded than that, and not really so damning. My fear about Kavanaugh isn't that he's a sexual predator. Barring new revelations, there's no evidence to suggest he is. Whatever else is true about him, Brett Kavanaugh doesn't seem to be that guy. More News Pulse news stories on the Supreme Court.